Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. We have Jonathan Vigliotti back with us. We'll chat with Jonathan in just a moment, but first, thanks for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please rate and review and follow or subscribe, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So Jonathan Vigliotti is an Emmy and Edward R. Murrow Award-winning CBS News national correspondent whose work has appeared on numerous platforms including CBS Sunday Morning, Face the Nation, 48 Hours, and more. His reporting has taken him to more than 40 countries and territories across 6 continents. He is the author of Before It's Gone, Stories from the Front Lines of Climate Change in Small-Town America, and his latest book is Torched, How a City Was Left to Burn and the Olympic Rush to Rebuild L.A., which is on sale now. Jonathan, welcome back into the back room.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So congrats on the book. It's called Torched, How a City Was Left to Burn and the Olympic Rush to Rebuild L.A., which is going to be out May 12th. So this is not just a story about fire. It's really one about money, politics, and bad decisions. Tell us about it and why you wanted to write about it.
Yeah, so this is a story about a disaster that struck the second largest city in the U.S. We're in the wildfire capital of America, if not the world. There were warnings about this fire weather a week before the event happened. The event happened exactly as forecasted. And yet in the buildup to the weather approaching, you had the local government here officials that weren't sounding the alarm. You had the public that was caught off guard. And when the fire eventually sparked, and I'm talking about the Palisades fire, that's the fire that I focus on in this book because it is the one that I reported on, there was chaos that unfolded in the streets. I did not think at the time when I was covering this fire, I covered it an hour or two after it sparked, and I stayed there through the duration of it, nearly a month. I didn't think that I didn't think about a book. I didn't think about writing one until my literary agent contacted me and said, you know, what's going on there is worthy of an investigation. And that's how this book came to be. And it would not have been possible if I wasn't there on the ground reporting and seeing firsthand the failures in real time. One of the messages that came out in the many press conferences that unfolded during the fire and after the fire was that there was nothing that could have been done. The historic weather, the historic nature of the wind made it impossible to fight. But I was there on the ground when the wind was still 10 miles per hour, long before it reached 100 miles per hour, as was forecasted later on in the evening. And what I saw were people fighting for their own lives without the support of the government, of police. Fire trucks couldn't get through. For many hours, there was no help coming. And there was more to this story I knew very early on than this was just extreme weather and nothing could be done. At the same time, as officials were saying nothing could be done, they were also urging a fast rebuild. And that there was a disconnect for me. How can you say there is nothing that we could have done to prevent this while also inspiring people through the lifting of regulations to move back and rebuild? In that disconnect, I saw a different reality, and it's one that I try to outline in this book.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into some of that with you in a bit. And for context, it's important to establish that you are a resident of Los Angeles and were at the time and still are, correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I live in Hollywood in the hills here. There was actually a fire that sparked in Runyon Canyon, which is very close by, around the same time that I was covering the fire in the Palisades, and my home was part of the mandatory evacuation order briefly. Fortunately, firefighters at that point, and this was days into the event, there were enough firefighters on the ground that were able to respond and contain the fire in the hills here. But unfortunately, that was not the case for the Palisades fire.
Mm-hmm. So to riff on what you were starting to say before, the book does address what is a century-old unchecked development and political mismanagement, which truly did set the stage for this disaster. Give us some insight into that.
Yeah, I mean, you talk about the Wild West, and I can't think of a place more wild than Pacific Palisades. It was a bluff. It is a bluff that 100 years ago was really hard to domesticate, to build. But at the same time, on the East Coast, you had suburbs start to emerge. And here on the West Coast, you had developers see wide open land, beautiful ocean views, and the possibility of their own development, their own suburbs here on the West. To build in a place like the Palisades and what became the Palisades back then, as it still is today, very clearly from the Palisades fire, incredibly risky. The environmental conditions alone, very dry. I mean, this is a desert landscape. You have mudslides when there is a lot of rain. You have drought during the summer, of course, the wildfire threat. So very tricky and very risky. At the time, it was very modest building about 100 years ago, but over the course of 100 years, you saw what began as small bungalows grow into mansions, grow into a very consolidated, dense population in an area that is hardwired to burn every year. It's part of the natural environment here. And without any of this building being checked properly, through regulations, through the changing of the guard here at City Hall and beyond, you just had wild development that grew into the hills right where there is fire every single year, and that acts as a fuse. So if a fire begins in the mountains, you've got neighborhoods right there on the foothills. It could carry that fire if left unchecked, as was the case on January 7th, 2025, right into the community itself. And so after 100 years of really unchecked building, and now with this fire that we saw lead to a conflagration where the homes became the fuel for the fire, you saw the devastating consequences of 100 years of radical building, very bold pioneering, but pioneering left unchecked that became very unsafe, I think is the easiest way to put it.
And if you had to divide the responsibility into two buckets, one being climate, one being just straight up human screw up, how do they get divided up?
I think it's a combination of the two, and both amplify one another. Obviously, climate change playing a significant role. Our weather has become more extreme and radicalized, and the rate of warming, we have never seen this in thousands of years, what has unfolded in just the past 5 or 6 decades. But climate change is one aspect of this. And there's habitat change. And I think this is kind of what you're getting to. How and where we build, if we're building responsibly, we have more people that are moving into areas that were once deemed unsafe. It's what's known as WUI, the wildland urban interface. And when you place more people in areas where there are threats like wildfire every single year, and when you amplify the threat of wildfire with climate change, so now you've got climate change, you've got habitat change, those two factors combined, those two ingredients become potentially a recipe for disaster if you don't have regulations, if you don't have a vibrant, healthy government that is securing those checks and balances to make sure that building is done safely, that residents, constituents, voters are taking the safest measures when they're trying to find a place to call home.
Was there a moment or two in particular, or a couple of experiences during the fires that will stay with you forever?
Yeah, a lot of it stays with me forever. I think most of it, which is why writing this book was actually a very cathartic experience, because it was a way to piece together these isolated moments, and there were so many of them over the course of 20 plus days of reporting. Honestly, the first moment, and I write about this in the book, was when my producer and my producer, Christian Duran, we were driving to the fire. So the CBS News Bureau, I'm a national correspondent with CBS News. The bureau's in Studio City. It's about a 20, 30-minute drive from the Palisades. As we were making our way to the Palisades, and at this point, the fire had already started, there were crews, like tree trimming crews with the city, that were cutting down tree limbs that were hanging over power lines. And that moment triggered something in me. The minute I saw it, I thought to myself, how can they be doing this work right now? Shouldn't this work have been done in the week leading up to this forecasted weather event? And to me, it reminded me of my experience covering the fire in Lahaina on the Hawaiian island of Maui. Christian Duran, my producer, covering the Palisades fire, we were together during the fire in Lahaina. And last time we spoke on the podcast, we talked about this a little bit briefly as well. It was a very similar dynamic there, where there was these warnings for about a week leading up to the event that destroyed Lahaina. And city crews, city officials, the mayor did not heed those warnings. And when the fire finally struck in Lahaina, it was playing catch up instead of really trying to protect ahead of the storm. When I saw those tree crews there as we were heading to this fire, I knew immediately there was some kind of disconnect from these weather warnings that had been issued 6, 7 days before to now this moment where the fire has erupted in the hills and you have crews as the wind starting to pick up now, trying to cut down tree limbs over power lines. And it only continued to grow, the chaos that we saw as I'm trying to piece all this together. About 30 minutes later, we found ourselves in traffic, bumper to bumper traffic. This was now in the heart of the Palisades. This is an hour into the fire starting. It's still burning in the hills. There were no evacuation orders. The city hadn't reached out in any single way to residents there, urging them to leave or giving them any kind of guidance. And in that void of information, there was panic on the streets. And what I saw as we were stuck in this traffic again brought me back to Lahaina, where so many people passed because they were stuck in their cars as the flames advanced. That chaotic evacuation that I saw in the Palisades was not only similar to what I saw in Lahaina, it was also very similar to what I saw with the campfire that destroyed Paradise, California in 2018. And I was looking at this and I was just saying, and this was one of the moments where I knew that what we were heading to could be historic. This was history repeating itself. We were able to, my crew and I, because at this point, it wasn't just myself and Christian, we had our photographer and our audio technician in separate vehicles behind us. In this bottleneck of traffic, I got out of the car and I knocked on the windows of drivers ahead of us, asking them if they could just drive a little bit ahead so we could squeeze through into a side road that eventually took us up into the mountainside, into these neighborhoods that were in the foothills of the Santa Monikas. And this was another really striking moment. We finally reached the area where the flames had started, where they were advancing into the first neighborhoods. And I was watching as the wind is now picking up. You have the rooftops of homes starting to catch, embers from flames in the mountains now being thrown and launched onto homes and actually starting fires. And it was safe enough for our crew to be there. There was another news crew there as well, but nowhere around us were there firefighters, were there police officers. And so we're standing there in the middle of all of this. There are residents with garden hoses trying to water down their roofs to prevent this fire from advancing. There are journalists there who are not trained to fight fire. We're trained to respond safely, but not to pick up a hose and fight a fire. We're all there. We're really at ground zero of where this fire is starting to enter into the first neighborhoods of the Palisades. And there was no help. Mm-hmm. And I started to post videos. I am not somebody, and I really should be better at this, considering it is my job to communicate. I'm not somebody that picks up social media as my first go-to. My priority is for the evening news in this case, or the morning show at CBS. But I remember seeing what I was seeing in a state of disbelief, and I needed to record it. I was just driven to record it. Something that, again, is not something that's part of my normal instinct. It's not my DNA. I pick up my phone and I'm recording the scenes around me, and I start to post it on Twitter and Instagram. And I'm talking in a matter of minutes, tens of thousands of views, hundreds of comments, people in the Palisades experiencing the same exact thing in their respective neighborhoods. Just total, utter chaos, no fire trucks around. That was the first 2 hours of this. And again, in my mind, I remember thinking, this can't be the full picture. Like, I'm in one small area. This can't be what other people are experiencing around the Palisades. Little did I know that would become the case. We did our live shot for the evening news. I guess it was 2.5 hours into all of this. We gathered our elements. We had to retreat because the fire was really starting to grow into the homes around us. It wasn't safe. We went downhill to the Presbyterian Church, the Pacific Palisades Presbyterian Church, where we set up to go live. It was far enough away to be safe, close enough to bear witness to what was happening. We had the fire in the background of our live shot. And as we're going live, a resident runs by and screams, "Where are the firefighters?" And again, it was just another red flag going off in my head that this is something that we really need to keep an eye on. Where are the firefighters? If this is becoming the common theme so early on, what does this mean about the response? And what does this mean about how this fire is going to grow? What kind of disaster are we witnessing in that moment? And it became very clear in the hours that followed that what was unfolding in Los Angeles was not just historic, it was catastrophic, and it was something that was going to change the landscape of the city as I knew it.
How do you explain that? And where do you place most of the blame for what you're describing?
I don't know how you explain it. I don't. If you are a leader of a city, and I am obviously alluding to Mayor Karen Bass, your job is public service and public safety. And when you have science telling you that there is fire weather in the forecast, and not just telling you it's in the forecast, it's also giving you specific locations, including the Pacific Palisades, I don't know how you missed those alarms. And in those first few days and weeks, I asked the same question, how? And that question became really the foundation for this book. The book was meant to be a completely different book. It was supposed to be just about risky development over the course of a century. It was initially called Wild Land, L.A. as part of land. But then as people started coming up to me, and by people, I mean those that work in City Hall and beyond, the sources that really make up this book, they were all saying the same thing to me. Look into what the mayor's office was doing before this fire, during this fire, and after this fire. This disaster did not need to happen. So how did this happen? A lot of risky choices that were made by the very people whose job it is to protect residents of a community. The mayor, Mayor Karen Bass, had an opportunity that was presented to her to go to Ghana as part of a diplomatic trip for the inauguration of the newly reelected president there. That trip was announced one day before she left. This was a week before the fire happened, as the alarms were already being sounded about fire weather in the forecast. The mayor, according to the sources that we spoke with, believed that this was a trip she could go on, that the risk was worth taking. The hope was that this forecast would not materialize. If the forecast had not materialized, she could have gone on this trip and possibly come back without anyone even knowing, because part of the plan, as I write about in the book, was to leave to Ghana without letting the public know that she was gone, because she was clearly, according to sources, aware of the fire forecast, the weather. The day that the weather was forecasted to hit, the 7th, was the exact day of this inauguration in Ghana. She took a chance, and the chance ultimately really backfired, because what she returned to a day after the fire started was the Palisades gone, and the city as she knew it at that point completely changed. And residents furious about what happened and why there wasn't any notice or indication of this weather approaching given to the public.
That's also absurd. And I wanted to ask you if there was anything else that maybe even more absurd or infuriating as a failure that you uncovered while reporting and researching the book.
Yeah, to keep, there are a lot of elements. Focusing on Ghana, and bear with me as I tell you this, because some of the backstory to it, and this is what we deeply report in the book, is the circumstances surrounding the decision and choices that were made to conceal the fact that Mayor Bass was not, in fact, in Los Angeles and in Ghana. There was a decision, according to several sources that I spoke with inside City Hall, familiar with the decision making. There was a decision at City Hall that was made to not publicize the trip to Ghana, to not make it clear that the mayor was going to be out of the country. What happened a day before Mayor Bass left to go to Ghana, an email was sent from her office to Marquise Harris Dawson, the council president, who acts as mayor whenever Mayor Bass is out of the area. And in that notification, it said that she's going to be traveling out of state There was no indication where she was going, nothing of the sort. Specifically, nothing mentioned about going to Ghana or being out of the country. In that absence and without clear direction, every emergency management leader that I've spoken with and sources that are connected to those departments said there was this kind of diffusion of responsibility. A lot of people were very unclear about what was happening, what was taking place to prepare for the weather. The mayor, it's not just a title. She is the commander in chief during disasters of this nature. It is her role to act essentially as a conductor, really coordinating different agencies and their response. That coordination never happened. And to add to the confusion with all of this, the mayor's office initiated this campaign, according to people that I spoke with, to make it appear that she was in Los Angeles when she was actually 7,000 miles away in Ghana. And how does this happen? Through social media. Over the course of the buildup to this fire, in the 6 days leading up to this disaster, as the forecasts are getting worse and worse and worse and historic in nature, never before has there been a 100-mile-per-hour wind forecast in Los Angeles. The mayor was posting about homelessness, videos and photos of her in the streets of Los Angeles, making it appear that she was actually in Los Angeles to anyone paying attention, when in fact she was not. And she was in Ghana. One person put it, she was pulling a Ferris Bueller. If you recall the movie, then you know exactly what the reference is, making it look like she was in one place when she was actually at a parade. And in this case, the parade was an inauguration. So that absence of leadership very early on really amplified the kind of disaster that this became. When the fire sparked, the mayor was out of pocket and hard to get in touch with. And because many officials did not know that Marquise Harris Dawson was now the acting mayor, because it really wasn't formalized in any official way beyond a small email sent to a very specific group of people, no one knew who to contact and where to go. So many people, instead of contacting Marquise Harris Dawson, who was on the ground in Los Angeles, they were trying to reach out to Mayor Bass, who was in Ghana and unavailable. Fire Chief Kristen Crowley, who has become a central focus of this and is a big player in this story and in the book, she reached out to the mayor about 20 plus minutes after the Palisades fire started. She got in touch with the mayor. It was the first time she found out that the mayor was not in the country. It was the first time she found out that she was in Ghana. She informed the mayor of what was happening. The mayor at this point had already been briefed by her advisors, but for the first time, the mayor was talking with her fire chief. The mayor said, "Thank you. You have every resource available to you. Please reach out to Marquise Harris Dawson. He's the acting mayor." They got off the phone. And instead of the mayor really tapping into and tuning into this disaster that's unfolding in her city, according to sources that I've spoken with, she attended a cocktail reception. Was held after the inauguration, and she attended that reception at the embassy residence, the U.S. Embassy's residence, ambassador's residence, for more than an hour, where she was not picking up her phone, responding to messages from city officials asking for help, offering help. For more than an hour, and a critical hour in the fire's growth, she was offline. And, there's the theory here that, leaders here on the ground in Los Angeles, the fire chief, the head of the emergency operations center, the police chief, could make decisions on their own. But unfortunately, in a disaster of this scale, and any leader knows this, you need the power of command, the chain of command. You need to have that order come from the top and work its way below. And that never happened because no one knew where the orders were coming from. And in that information vacuum, the information vacuum that was unfolding in City Hall and beyond, in the very offices that are structured to handle and respond to crises of this scale, there was chaos. And that quickly mirrored the chaos on the streets.
So let's talk about another commander-in-chief who was available. Donald Trump, President Donald Trump. If we all remember what he was doing and saying back then, he was very quick to start placing blame. He was referring to Governor Gavin Newsom as Newscum, his favorite nickname for him. But he claims that the state or the governor turned the water off. Based on your reporting, how detached is that claim from reality?
100%.
I knew you were going to say that.
I mean, 100% detached and 100% not surprising. President Trump is a known political animal. And what he says sometimes has to be taken with a grain of salt. Many grains of salt in this case. The water was never turned off. And unfortunately, that was the least of the concerns, really. So much else was turned off in terms of how the structure and chain of command worked. The water was the least of the concerns. And I think the confusion here, and there was a lot of confusion very early on because you have the Santa Ynez Reservoir. It's this reservoir near the Pacific Palisades. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of water are normally in that reservoir. It was a reservoir that was created to help with pressure for situations just like this. There was a fire that happened in Bel Air back in the 1960s. Water pressure did not flow. There just wasn't enough of it, and hundreds of homes burned. And so the Santa Ynez Reservoir was created to help with that pressure, almost like a backup blood supply. During the winter months, which are typically rainy months where you don't have wildfire traditionally, it's safe to leave that reservoir empty, as was the case here. It was cleared out of its water for repairs. Unfortunately, the city never made it very clear to the fire department, to other emergency departments, that the water was not in the reservoir. So when this fire sparked, a lot of crews were sent to that reservoir only to find it empty. And without that reservoir there, that pressure was not there to help water flow to fire hydrants. That led to a lot of fire departments that were responding. We're talking at the peak, and this is days later, you're having hundreds of engines that are on the scene. They're tapping into fire hydrants that don't have water coming out of them. But the Santa Ynez Reservoir, while it is easy to point fingers at the failure of having it full of water, the lack of water speaks to the lack of preparation, truly, and the lack of repositioning, because every home is connected to the water line. And when you lose a home, that water line is exposed. And so it hemorrhages all of that water like blood. And you did not have fire crews responding to this fire as they should have early on. You had 1, 2, 3 dozens, hundreds of homes burning to their foundations, their water pipes becoming exposed, that water bleeding out. So really, the Santa Ynez Reservoir could have helped early on if there was a healthy and robust response. But I think really the big issue was the overall lack of response. Because even with that water, had that water been there, with all those homes that were destroyed by the fire because you did not have firefighters there on the scene to stop the flames from advancing, you could have millions and millions of gallons in that reservoir, and it still would not have been enough to stop the bleed that was happening with every home that was going up. So the water was not turned off. There was bad planning involved in the fact that the Santa Ynez Reservoir wasn't there. To Trump's point, there was definitely a lack of preparation with this fire. He called Gavin Newsom, his favorite nickname, Gavin Newscum, blamed the fire on Gavin Newsom and on Mayor Bass. The language was harsh. It was premature. It was before anything was clear. It certainly didn't help, as there was this desperate effort to protect the Palisades. But at the same time, there was some truth to the frustration, as the reporting that I've done, and this was an investigation that stretched on for 10 months. I finished kind of the main reporting of this book in November. As that reporting has shown, from a leadership perspective, there were failures. Turning off the water was not one of them.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that the guy who wages a war of choice in Iran and was surprised that Iran would shut off the Strait of Hormuz is criticizing L.A.'s prep. Doesn't mean that they didn't prep. It just means he's not the one to criticize it. But so I guess it's as detached from reality when he then said later on, he sent in troops to turn the water on.
Yes. It is detached from reality, and I know that reality well because I was reporting on this. The water was never turned on.
Like we at home had this vision of like guys, strong guys, like turning this circular knob, and the water just started flowing downhill to
it,
L.A.
it never happened, and there was a reservoir hundreds of miles north of us where the water was allowed to flow, but that water did not flow to Southern California, certainly Los Angeles. In fact, every expert we spoke with said that water probably ended up just being pumped out eventually into the Pacific Ocean. So it was an effort that for the cameras may have looked good, but when we're talking about in reality, had no impact whatsoever on the Pacific Palisades. Not to mention the timing of all of this. That water flowed, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks after the fire started. At this point, crews were starting to finally get the upper hand on it. It didn't. Water at that point was not the issue. Water was the issue day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 into this, not on week 3 or 4. And it's the failure in the first few days. And in bringing up and kind of taking the spotlight away from the failures in those first few days, there was never really an effort to understand what went wrong to prevent this from happening again. So much focus politically was on the reservoir, was on turning off the water, which in my view was a big distraction from the much simpler part of this story, which was something as easy as prep. We prepare when we have tests in elementary school, in middle school, in high school, in life. When it was a matter of life and death, there was no preparation whatsoever. And as I was writing this book, it was those kinds of comments coming from the president, but coming from everybody really, that distracted and pulled focus from what really led to this disaster.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you next, which is that level of misinformation and just flat out hatred for Gavin Newsom and wanting to punitively take it out on California because it's a blue state, blah, blah, blah. How much did that undermine the effort to combat these fires?
I think it was, and I've heard, and I say I've heard because Governor Newsom has declined many requests to speak with me personally, and the same is true for Mayor Bass. But both have spoken with other news agencies and news organizations and touched on this point. It was a distraction. It was background noise, but it did not pull their attention, they say, from trying to contain these fires. With that said, when you've got that kind of criticism flowing from the top, that is unnecessary pressure when you're in a crisis situation. Mm-hmm. Pointing fingers so early on, regardless of who's doing the pointing, especially when you have a crisis of this scale and it is not, it has not been put out fully. It wasn't until the end of January that the Palisades fire was deemed 100% contained. When you have that kind of noise, that kind of finger pointing, that kind of rhetoric, you're really pulling focus from the main issue, from the fire, from public safety. And so from what the governor has said and from what the mayor has said, it did not distract them. That's what they say. But it is hard not to imagine a world where you have mounting pressure as you're trying to contain a fire that has already destroyed a place as important and special as the Palisades. It's hard not to listen to that and be distracted by that. And from those that I've spoken with, sources that I have spoken with, that weighed very heavily on the mayor and the governor as they were trying to contain this crisis.
And why do you think Newsom wouldn't talk to you?
I don't know. That's a question for the governor. I very early into this fire, and when I say early in, it was day 2, it was the 8th or the 9th. It's correct in the book, and all the days do really blur together. It was the 9th because the mayor was finally back from Ghana. She arrived on the 8th, so one day after the fire started, and on the 9th, she started to hold press conferences. And I'm talking about the mayor now. I know your question was about Newsom, but it is all connected. Mm-hmm. Because when the mayor stepped up to that podium, I asked her specifically about her decision to leave, knowing about the weather. And it really, for the first time, put her on the spot where she couldn't come up with a strong answer. And it was a Q&A that went viral. She received a lot of negative feedback from that moment. And the governor, as a result, my understanding from some of those that I've spoken with, as I've attempted many times to set up an interview, the governor did not want to be presented with similar questions. There was also a lot of back and forth and a lot of trouble brewing behind the scenes between the governor and the mayor. The governor, on a podcast that he went on, this was about a week or two into this crisis, as the fire is still burning, but containment is now picking up, said he wasn't getting straight answers. He was unable to figure out what was going on, who was doing what. So with that frustration, and I think with that behind the scenes bickering that was unfolding, according to those that I've spoken with, I think the decision was made not to add more fuel to that fire. And my line of questioning was very clear. I asked a number of questions over the course of a few weeks at these press conferences. Each one became a viral moment. Each one was ultimately unflattering to the response. And I think from those that I've spoken with, there was this clear decision made not to put any more oxygen into that early response, as the focus was really shifting and very early on into the recovery. It was like, we've got this disaster, we have this town, this community that's now been destroyed. Let's switch gears completely. Let's change the optics of this. And I think not talking to me was part of this decision to change the optics. Let's focus on something positive, rebuilding the Olympics. That was very much the focus. Anything that distracted from that was deemed off guards. And I think I fell into that off guards group of people.
So let's talk about that rebuilding, because this is important, as you alluded to before. LA has an attraction to reinvention and a reverence for, moving fast and breaking things. And now it's preparing for the Olympic Games in 2028, and with a focus perhaps on maximizing profits. Is the city being put at great risk again? Are the residents being put at great risk again? Are we rebuilding for safety, or are we rebuilding for TV cameras here?
I believe that we're rebuilding for TV cameras. I think the way that this is being done, the way that it's being presented, the way that it's being actualized, it's for speed, but not just speed, for shortcuts, so that you've got a beautiful city come the Summer Olympics in 2028. I spoke with one person who said, speed is not the enemy of good, but shortcuts almost always are. And shortcuts have been taken. I told you about how very early on the optics shifted from what was lost to how to rebuild and regain. What I'm talking about here is within 24 hours. As the fire is still burning, there are not enough crews even on the ground. People are still dying. And you have the mayor and the governor, according to sourcing, talking specifically about the Olympics and how to rebuild. You then had the mayor on record in press conferences in that first 24-hour period talking about the need to rebuild. So questions hadn't even been asked about how did this happen in the first place, and the focus was already on rebuilding. But how can you rebuild in a way that keep a community safe if you don't know what the vulnerabilities were? And what is so interesting, part of this was part of what the governor later described as a Marshall Plan, comparing this disaster to post World War II rebuilding, as if the climate and Mother Nature follows some kind of peacetime agreement, and that's not the case. And as this Marshall Plan was being discussed, scientists, forensic wildfire scientists that are tasked with figuring out the vulnerabilities of communities were just arriving in the Palisades to determine what happened, what caused this kind of historic conflagration, how can you prevent it? And the findings, it took 2 weeks to first go through home after home, to look at the vulnerabilities, to look at the homes that were lost, the homes that were burned but still stood, the homes that survived. It took weeks, but weeks is a pretty fast timeline, especially when the fire is still burning in this period of time. And they determined, the scientists that were there on the ground, that there were a number of things that could have been done to prevent this fire from wiping out an entire zip code. Yes, You would have had homes lost no matter what, one scientist told me. But you did not have to lose an entire zip code. One of the most critical elements to rebuilding safely is creating space between homes. When you've got a windstorm of this event, of this scale, 100-mile-per-hour winds, you have blowtorch condition. So the further homes are from one another, the safer they are. And we're not talking a great distance. We're talking something as simple as 20 feet makes a huge impact. But in the urge to rebuild, and before those findings even came out, the mayor's office lifted regulations allowing, in an effort to entice people back to these places, to rebuild larger, 10% larger. So in no way are these scientists saying we need to scale down these communities, we need to shrink these homes, but they are saying they should not be bigger. That is one thing they guarantee. Another thing they found was issues with building codes in general and fire code. Fire code is a spectrum. There is the bare minimum that needs to be met in order to get a permit to build a home, and then there is what exceeds that bare minimum. And those are materials that are far more fire resilient than the bare minimum wood treated materials that are used. When we talk about, the best of the best materials, concrete composite, it's concrete mixed with styrofoam, kind of like a Dunkin' Donuts cup, super light, super cheap, the same price as wood, 4 times more fire resistant, meaning it can push back flames 4 times longer than specially chemically treated wood, which lasts about an hour, can hold flames out of a house for about an hour. Now you're talking 4 hours if you have this special new material, and by new, 20 years old. So it's been around, it's been on the market, but it's not advertised often, especially by government officials for reasons that are unclear. When you didn't have a fire response that we were expecting with this fire, firefighters on the streets in the first few minutes, in the first few hours, you can see why having this higher spectrum of fire resistant material is important. It buys time for troops to arrive and to contain this. Instead, you have homes being rebuilt at the bare minimum. The bare minimum is better than nothing at all. And a lot of these homes were grandfathered into old regulations that didn't require them to meet building codes. So there is progress on that front. I don't want to discredit the rebuild in total. But when you have an entire neighborhood, an entire community that was wiped out, 80% of the Palisades wiped out, you would think, and this comes from scientists I've spoken with and from a lot of experts, that there would be a way of rethinking rebuilding in a uniform way, not making every home look the same, but in a way where the best of the best materials are being used. Doing so not only creates safer conditions for residents, when each home holds back flames 4 hours longer than the home next to it, that's an incredible amount of time that is bought. It's not just about doing that. It's not just about safety. It's also about affordability. We have an insurance crisis here in the state of California. Getting fire insurance is very hard. You have insurers that are pulling out of the market entirely. And the reason they're doing so is because they are not seeing these materials being used in a way that protects them, that protects their assets. And when you start to implement these new materials, you not only provide safety, build in safety to a community, you build in financial stability as well. There's a community south of here near San Diego that was built with these new materials. They are safer homes. They are about 20 to 30 feet apart, which would prevent flames from, in these blowtorch conditions, jumping from one home to another in theory. But beyond that, they're insured at rates that are affordable to homeowners at a time when people here rebuilding in Los Angeles are struggling to rebuild because there's been delay and denial on their policies. And you have insurance providers that are just pulling out and not even offering new insurance for new homes that are going up. So it's a very tricky situation. And if we're not factoring in safety, and if we're not factoring in the insurance industry into this, we are just setting the stage for another disaster happening. And before that disaster happens, we're setting the stage for a community like the Palisades, which was a mixed community. It started as a blue-collar community, turned into one of fame and wealth. But now, almost certainly, this is going to be a community transformed forever, where only the wealthy can afford to move back in and take those risks.
I mean, what you're describing, it sounds like we're basically, I was going to say sleepwalking, but we're walking eyes wide open into more disasters like this, because it's politically inconvenient or because of regulation or for economic reasons, we just don't want to deal with reality.
I believe so. And I think that there are easy ways to change this. The local government here, the state government, they came together with like this one-stop shop of a department where homeowners could go get permitting, look at materials, you name it, insurance, everything, and then figure out how they're going to move forward with their home. Unfortunately, there was no discussion, there's no material that's been offered, no guidance that's being offered by the government in the safest ways to rebuild. Most people don't even know that there's a spectrum of fire code, that there's the bare minimum, which is in theory faster to implement because it's the status quo. And then there is that exceeds it. I'm talking about that concrete composite. So many people I've spoken with said they had no idea that material was even available and how helpful it would be if the government made that information available. And not only that, but made the supplies, made the materials easy to get. It streamlined it because certainly wood is easier to get. But with that said, there are ways to make other materials easy to get. And instead, that decision has been passed on. And you have residents that are really navigating bureaucratic red tape, a lot of uncertainty, trying to now figure out how to build a safe home on their own without any kind of uniform guidance from above. It's a very similar failure to what happened with unified guidance leading up to this fire weather. People, evacuating in chaotic conditions and now rebuilding in confusing conditions.
My last question has to do with the ocean, the Pacific, because there are people on one end who say, oh my God, it's so toxic. Do not go in there because of everything that was dumped in there. And then there's people who are like totally safe and everybody in between. Where do you stand on the condition of the ocean right now in that particular part of town?
I've always followed the science and I've always followed the testing. I think early on, the testing made it very clear it was not safe. There was debris. For the first few months, you had toxic runoff, especially when it rained and when all of that leaked and drained into the Pacific Ocean. But tests today, and they really have for the past, I would say, 5-6 months, have shown that levels of any kind of toxins, any kind of chemical trace in the Pacific are safe. I go swimming in the Pacific. I will probably be going there later on today with my dog. It is safe now. And that's not me guessing. That is me following the science. I believe the science. The science says it's safe. It is safe. But we can't lose sight of how unsafe it was for a while and the long-term impacts that could have on that habitat, that ecosystem, the animals and wildlife that call the Pacific home. I think that's going to take a much longer period of time to get the full picture of the impact.
You've covered a lot of chaos in your career, a lot of environmental disasters, natural disasters. Where do the LA fires rank on the holy shit, this is bad scale?
I mean, on the holy shit, this is bad scale, I would say this is the worst. I would say it's the worst. And it's hard to say that. It's hard to compare one disaster to another. It really is. I mean, I talked about the Lahaina fires. More than 100 people were killed in that fire. Terrible. I was there from beginning to end. That community is still struggling to rebuild, still struggling to understand what happened, the trauma, the PTSD. That is something that has a half-life that's going to take many years, if ever, for people to come to terms with. Here in LA, you had the Palisades fire, you had the Eaton fire in Altadena, more than 30 people were killed. Obviously, that's a different toll than what happened in Lahaina. But this is the second largest city in the country, the wildfire capital of America, as we started this conversation talking about. This should not happen here.
Right. It sounds like that's the reason behind.
That's the reason behind, because this was preventable. It truly was. And I know that sounds like my opinion now, but that is my opinion now, channeling the many people and fire experts I've spoken with who have echoed the same thing and really seared that into my mind, which led to this book being written. And as I wrote this book, all of this was just only confirmed. This could have been prevented. And I think the fact that this could have been prevented, that you have one of the best firefighting departments in the world, and that this fire still took out an entire community, To me, that has upended my own sense of safety. This wasn't just limited to the Palisades. The Palisades was destroyed, but you had the entire city for more than a week terrified by every weather notification. You had emergency alerts going out telling people to evacuate that were wrong. You had people evacuating from communities that weren't even threatened by fire. You had chaos in a city that was built to bring order. And for that period of time, it was like living in a dystopian society. And perhaps I'm biased here because this is the place I call home. It's not like the other communities destroyed by disasters that I have parachuted into and then have the luxury of leaving. Maybe that bias is coming through in my answer. But I also believe when you have the best of the best tasked with preventing the worst of the worst, and they fail in such a way that the worst of the worst happens, I can't think of a worst case scenario. And in the way that we're rebuilding and the lack of accountability that has only followed and more than a year into this continues to follow, I don't see a way out of breaking this pattern.
Well, you get into so much more in the book. Folks, check it out because it's a really fascinating and important subject. The book, again, is called Torched: How a City Was Left to Burn and the Olympic Rush to Rebuild L.A. It is out May 12th. Jonathan, good luck with the book, and thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Andy. I really appreciate it.
All righty, take care.
Yeah, you too.
Good luck, man.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate your time.
Likewise.
I hope that worked for you.
Oh, it's great. Really great.
Right.
Take care.
Okay, take care.
This episode was produced and edited by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg and Jen Hammoud for Radio Free Rhinecliff, with additional editing by Maddie Rosenberg, music by Andrew Hollander, and graphic design by Cricket Langell. And with a special thanks to our sponsor, The Epicurean. Again, thanks for listening. Please rate and review wherever you get your podcasts, and subscribe to the Backroom with Andy Ostroy YouTube channel, where you can watch full videos of our interviews. See you next time.